They directed their critiques at the shortcomings of a social system that placed its faith on the majority's ambivalence to a comprehensive social justice, and that led to political instability, often tending to war and tyranny, and the lack of moral virtues. In their view, democracy in Athens promoted injustices occasioned by a superficial and selfish ethic of egalitarianism, the widespread pursuit of indolent pleasures, and the absence of genuine social and moral aims. Although we may not relate necessarily or side with the Greek philosopher's solution to these problems, we can understand their appraisal of the political problems of their times. It is not my intention here to add another critique to an ongoing instrumentalization of democratic principles by liberal capitalist machines and political regimes. Ever since economic prosperity has become the cornerstone, if not the whole edifice of public policy, almost universally, people, communities, and the physical environment are increasingly treated as resources, investments, and potential capital. This debilitating and narrow view of humanity and nature is reinforced by an equally misplaced and short-sighted vision of individualism perpetuated by social institutions, educational establishments, mass media, family settings, and the global market. The universal promotion of an appetitive and selfish individual is built on the premise that the individual is the best, indeed, the only qualified judge of its own interests, and therefore he should be entitled and encouraged and made as free as possible to fashion a life based on the gratification of desires and wants. Since the self is conceived and shaped in terms of appetites, wants, and aversions, it comes to reflect the image of its greedy, unsatisfied, and immodest maker, the global market. Today, we live in the age of so-called mass democracy, brandished and marketed in the media as the world's universal religion, with its own production and reproduction of doctrines and truths about human nature and associated rights, such as freedom of choice, equality, self-determination, and so forth. In his critical studies, Michel Foucault challenged the mass mythology of the individual self, as it is invariably linked with the cultivation and legitimation of political and economic exploitation processes in our societies and with institutional regimes of domination. He writes, "I think that if one wants to analyze the genealogy of the subject in Western civilization, he has to take into account not only techniques of domination, but also techniques of the self. He has to take into account the interaction between those two types of techniques. He has to take into account the points where the technologies of domination of individuals over one another have recourse to processes by which the individual acts upon himself. And conversely, he has to take into account the points where the techniques of the self are integrated into structures of coercion and domination. The contact point where the individuals are driven by others is tied to the way they conduct themselves, is what we can call, I think, government. In my understanding, knowledge of the processes through which the self is constituted as a subject, however these are derived and explained, cannot be separated from the broader sphere of human culture and expression, including political awareness and economic policy, embedded in our views, language, and actions." So, inspired by Foucault's critique, in the following paper, I wish to ground many of the problems that we face today on unhealthy and unviable models of individuality, and gear the discussion on alternative cultures of self, which directly or indirectly challenge the proximity of self-experience and the constitution of subjectivity that lies at the foundation of contemporary economic, political, and social today, I believe that there is a great deal we can learn from the philosophical orientation of Buddhism concerning a set of practices and the minimization of suffering for all beings, and the cultivation of virtuous traits of character, such as compassion, patience, generosity, wisdom, and so forth. The contrast between the two respective orders is nevertheless real. Garfield keenly observes that Buddhism and liberal democracy are diametrically opposed on this issue, namely, the direction of legitimation as between procedure and the conception of the good. He nevertheless goes on to argue that they are capable not only of fusion, but compatible and complementary in a deep sense. I will contend that there is another fundamental tension between democracy and Buddhism that lies in the view of the individuals, and not in a metaphysical sense, as an owner of experiences, a thinker of thoughts, and an agent of actions. For this reason, the self does not need to be discovered, according to some schools of psychoanalysis, in the dungeons of the unconscious, nor be incited to express sense objects. Like a reflection in a mirror constitutes the provisional subject of discourse and the focus of mindful contemplation and observation. I believe that Buddhism has much to offer to the discussion of the synthesis between ethical, social. Common to all Buddhist schools and traditions is a set of psychosomatic categories that constitute the self. These are known as the 5 aggregates, the skandha: forms, feelings, perceptions, dispositional formations, and consciousness. The first of the aggregates refers to 6 sense organs and their corresponding objects of perception. The remaining 4 aggregates are mental processes, while all 5 constitute a complex of relations and experiences that make up a person, and each moment of compelled to think, feel, and act as though one had an inherent self to protect and preserve, is the very root of suffering. Quoting Varela, the slightest encroachment on the self's territory, a splinter in the finger, a noisy neighbor, arouses fear and anger. The slightest hope of self-enhancement, gain, praise, fame, pleasure, arouses greed and grasping. Any hint that a situation is irrelevant to the self, waiting for a bus or meditating, arouses boredom. Such impulses are instinctual, automatic, pervasive, and powerful. They are completely taken for granted in daily life. Essential to the understanding of how suffering arises by mistakenly identifying with the aggregates and fostering an objective sense of their ownership is detailed. Suffering arises is detailed in the Four Noble Truths. These are called truths not as a matter of faith or convention, but because they offer empirically verifiable reflections for viewing and assessing human experience. The first noble truth states that there is a lack of satisfaction and accompanying forms of suffering. This is a shared human predicament, regardless of one's religious beliefs, social and ethnic status, and individual circumstances. Everyone, everywhere, at some point suffers, at birth, in sickness, and in death, but also when confronted with psychophysical experiences of an infinite variety, like unfulfilled needs, failing aspirations, mental and emotional anguish, and physical irritation. In the Dhammacakkappavatthana Sutta, the Buddha proclaimed that lack of satisfaction is a pervasive human condition, but he did not single out an I that suffers. This is a crucial point. Instead of highlighting a personal experience of suffering, the Buddha avoided theorizing on a substantive I outside the field of perception and experience, not unlike the thesis promoted by the Scottish philosopher David Hume, who said that self-identity is fiction. This brings us to the second noble truth that investigates the roots of dissatisfaction in our lives, which have much to do with an understanding of who we are, as they do with the ways we talk or remain silent about it, that in turn reinforce our perception as a suffering subject. The origins of suffering are inseparable from our craving to become something, to become someone, to gratify sense pleasures, and resort to all kinds of mental, emotional, and physical stratagems, to satisfy our desires and avoid that which is physically, mentally, and emotionally unpleasant. The acknowledgement that suffering originates in ignorance of the relational nature of desire leads to the third noble truth that states that all that is subject to arising is also subject to ceasing. In other words, dukkha ceases when we eradicate the cause of suffering, namely ignorance in regards to desire's mode of arising and ceasing. The fourth noble truth is prescriptive in that it outlines the practical means and methods for the cessation of the cause of ignorance and its accompanying forms of discontent. These means are subsumed in the Eightfold Path. These 8 aspects of self-practice do not form distinct disciplines in a hierarchical or sequential order. They're in mutual support of each other, while central to all is the right view of non-self and the cultivation of right intention based on goodwill, non-violence, and non-attachment, which leads to the development of wisdom, or prajna. The notion of right is here understood as the perfection of practice, the union of application and correct knowledge, while all preoccupations and notions related to the existence of self are wrong views. So I will have to skip a substantial part of my paper and go to the conclusion. There's much more I could say, but you understand, we're running out of time. So anyway, in my paper, which you haven't heard, I have attempted to suggest something of the complexity of the concept of the individual from a Buddhist perspective. And it might be useful to summarize some of the different levels of analysis implied by such a concept. The study of self in Buddhism requires a multi-leveled approach. For understanding at one level should be compared and eventually reconciled with all other levels. At the beginning level of analysis, we acknowledge active human agents in society. This seems so basic, and it goes without saying. After all, every known community seems to have found it necessary to assign distinct names and responsibility to its members. But this level of analysis is only the first step, and it takes us almost nowhere. Both in Buddhism and in Western models, the individual must be conceived to be capable of motivated action and initiating decisions. The individual must constitute a locus capable of action. As argued by Collins, one might say that human beings are articulated conceptually as agents by themselves and in relation to each other, in different ways and in different discourses. However, the notion of the individual's volition does not turn him into an independent and substantial entity, since both the mind and the physical body of man is understood not as a singular unit, but as a conglomeration of aggregates arising according to causes and conditions. The sense of individuality that emerges must be illuminated from within. That is to say, it is crucial that the individual becomes aware of what he designates as self, and by extension his actions, at least the most important, which are predicated or capable of being predicated upon the notion of self or I. The process of becoming cognizant of the cognitive act is a basic activity of intelligent systems. But when one correctly understands the cognitive process as a conditioned phenomenon, one abandons a self-centered investigation into the past, present, and future. The Buddhist teachings provide a variety of skillful techniques to illustrate how cognition shapes our perception of the world rather than reflecting an external reality already in existence. The combination of this approach, do I have enough time? No, just, all right, I'll go to the very end. What may emerge from our observations of a Buddhist notion of a centerless self is the production of a relational self, dependent upon causal operations that manifest in changing context and along ever-shifting connections transpiring in the natural and social world. These ways of looking and assessing our individual subjectivity bear implications beyond the fields of psychology and cognitive studies. The discourse on selflessness is very much a discipline and a prescriptive discourse on self-cultivation and liberation from bondage that is suffering. One cannot theoretically recreate or anticipate the results of personal and social transformation. One has to embody the transformation and experience the world through it. The self-abandoning, self-cultivating approach of Buddhism offers a fundamental challenge to existing notions of individuality and the politics of self as constructed by liberal consumer-based societies. The ideas, beliefs, and dogmas we hold about who we are, not restricted to the level of ideology. They are at the source of our present environmental, economic, and social crisis, in that they reflect in direct and concrete ways the kinds of systems, educational, social, and political, we support willingly or unwillingly, consciously or unconsciously. Foucault comments in the preface to Gilles Deleuze's Anti-Oedipus, Capitalism and Schizophrenia. They resonate with some of the concerns we addressed here. Do not demand of politics that it restore the rights of the individual as philosophy has defined them. The individual is the product of power. What is needed is to de-individualize by means of multiplication and displacement, diverse combinations. The group must not be the organic bond uniting hierarchicized individuals, but a constant generator of de-individualization. The starting point for social change cannot rest on the demands we place on others, but on the demands we place on the self as a liberating discipline and form of practice. Thank you.